gave us a totally new image of the biological world because he explained how that enormous diversity of animal and plant life could have evolved, and that was simply amazing.
Well, for me as a biologist, I mean, Darwin's great legacy is, of course, the actual theory that he brought into being, you know, the theory of natural selection. And when you combine that with genes, which, of course, came much later, and give us the current theory of evolution, this is the theory that's really mapped out the pathway for biologists to follow ever since. It's a working theory. It does real work for us in the laboratory. It gives us the framework within which all biological research is carried out. So that, to me, is the great brilliance of Darwin, that he gave us this fantastic theory that actually makes sense of lots of biological data.
Darwin's legacy is one of a great scientist. There's no doubt that he did a tremendous amount of careful experimental observation, barnacles, pigeons, that's brought out in the film, but many other things as well. And he was an accomplished and rightly acknowledged empirical scientist.
At the same time, of course, his thinking has had a huge impact upon the way we think of ourselves as humans in the world. The fact that we're connected up to all living things, the fact that we're all part of this great history of life. And I think that's definitely changed our understanding of our role in the world.
But sadly, he brought with him a worldview which was based really on presuppositions which I would suggest come from his father and his grandfather. Good scientific inquiry is one thing, and we should all have that. We should follow where the evidence leads. But I would suggest that his grand view of the evolution of man proposed in The Origin of Species, the molecules to man idea, did not really come from the evidence so much as from a presupposition, which he was intent really on proving.
I think that the idea of Dennett, that Darwin's ideas are dangerous, is simply silly. There is nothing in Darwin's evolutionary theory that is dangerous, unless you think it goes against religion. And that's hardly dangerous, that's extremely sensible.
And so there is a dangerous idea, which is not flowing from natural selection, it's flowing from a very different philosophy, which is imposed upon the science, trying to make out that the science is justifying this very unbiblical belief, of course, which tries to make out that we've been here for millions of years and that much less complex creatures have gradually moved up in the ascendancy of life till, hey presto, we have man. Now that is a very wrong idea, and in that sense it's dangerous. But it's not natural selection which is the problem. It's not the science which is the issue. It's the worldview which is wrong.
If you think that natural selection is the only story to tell about living things, or for example why we're here on this earth, if you're like Dawkins, who talks about humans being and all living things being survival machines simply to help the genes to survive and pass on the genes to the next generation, then of course it is dangerous. If that's all life is, we as scientists are quite used to giving a scientific account, but realizing also there's another narrative which we can tell, many other narratives we can tell about the same thing. So I think it's not dangerous as long as we incorporate it within other narratives. Something kill God? No, I don't think so.
No more so than wrong thinking can actually bury the truth.
In my view, Darwin certainly did not kill God. God really killed himself because there's no evidence for him whatsoever. In my view, there is no relationship whatsoever between science and religion. Science is based on evidence. Religion is based on mystical beliefs, and therefore there is no contact whatsoever between them. Nevertheless, there are scientists who somehow manage to believe in religion. Isaac Newton was one, and in the modern world there are some. How they manage to sort out this contradiction, I don't fully understand.
No, for me, science and religion are first cousins. I mean, first cousins occasionally squabble, but they're best of friends most of the time. And in fact, of course, if you look at science, it emerged out of this theological worldview. It started with the Greeks, it was picked up by the Arabs, it was extended in Christian Europe, and it emerged really out of a theistic understanding of the world. It emerged from Christians. In fact, if we're thinking about now modern science, who believed that God had established laws of the universe, and therefore there were laws that we need to find out as scientists. We need to explore the universe and discover what kind of laws those are. Very much for those early modern scientists, they saw their voyage of scientific exploration as a way of giving worship to God as the author of everything that there is. And I think that tradition is carried on right up to the present day.
Good science will never disagree with any of the statements in the Bible from my own convictions, from my own observations, from my own readings. Well, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and he made different creatures eventually on the fifth and sixth days. None of the things that we actually read of in terms of what the Bible states happened conflict with our actual observational science, and I stress the observational science. They don't, of course, agree with all the theories that people have put out and to try and explain the observations. The actual observations fit beautifully with an originally created perfect world.
Darwin's arguments about the origin of different animals is very persuasive and is totally different from the religious view about special creation, God creating this animal, this plant, or something like that. First of all, there's no evidence for a creator. There's no evidence for God. And Darwin's theory, particularly in the modern biological world, is extremely convincing. That doesn't mean to say we've solved every evolutionary problem, but this is science, and with time we'll get there.
For me, natural selection is simply a description of the way that God has chosen to bring biological diversity into being. And so I, as a biologist, all the biology I do, all the scientific descriptions I give, because I'm a Christian, I just see those as descriptions of the way that God has set up the world, the way that he makes things operate, and so forth. Kepler, the astronomer, once said, that as we do science, it's like thinking God's thoughts after him. And so as a biologist, we're exploring the way that God has set up the world. So natural selection is a wonderful insight into the way that biological diversity comes about. But certainly it's not a gap that one wants to fill with God in some way, because as a Christian I believe that God is the author of the whole of creation. He's the author of all the living things and the whole of the wonder of the universe that we see all around us.
It is curious that I do think that if you are religious, you could deal with natural selection by saying this was God's way of doing things. So it is possible to believe in natural selection and think that God chose to do this. But, and I must emphasize this, the evidence for God is zero.
The whole of the created order gives tremendous testimony to the fact that God has made creatures with different structures. There's different basic structures in birds than there are in reptiles. The bird has a totally different lung system, both to a reptile and to a mammal. A bird doesn't have a diaphragm, whereas reptiles and mammals do. I mean, there's a whole host of evidence which bears out that God definitely created the world. Natural selection is simply the fact that you get, as Darwin found them, different types of finches on different islands, still finches. You get different types of eagles, bald eagles, fish eagles, probably all descended from an original eagle kind. I know it sounds very odd to people today, but it doesn't negate what the Bible says, that they all came from an original created eagle, an original created finch kind, and so on and so forth.
For me, the toughest question as a cell biologist is the origin of life itself, how the first cell evolved. And the other great problem, about which I don't understand anything, is the nature of consciousness, how all those cells in our brain allow us to have emotions and to see different colors and things like that. The approach to questions like the origin of life require experiment, and there are a lot of people working on this, and there are a lot of people working on consciousness, and eventually, it may take a long time, as we understand, for example, more about the brain, these ideas will become clearer, but it may take a very long time.
I think the toughest questions for any biologist to face is, of course, their personal experience of suffering. Darwin himself had many personal experiences of suffering. As we know, he lost 3 of his children very sadly in childhood. In a sense, evolution makes the problem of suffering worse, because we now know what a huge amount of pain and death and suffering there has been over billions of years in order that this amount of biological diversity should come and go upon planet Earth. But at the same time, I think the science itself has helped in that area somewhat. It doesn't give us all the final answers, But it's helped us to see that all life is carbon-based life, and once you have carbon-based life, then inevitably you have carbon-based death. And so in that sense, it's a package deal. Biology is a package deal, and we now understand that much more now than we did in pre-Darwinian times. And I think that's helped us to see that all of this pain and all of this life and death is not some fickle passage, it's not some fickle happening in this life, but it's essential if we are to be here, it's essential if all other living things are to be there.
I think probably the biggest problems that we face are to do with how did light get from the stars to the Earth, when clearly the stars are billions of light years away. People ask, well, how on earth can you see the stars when we've only been here for a few thousand years, according to the Bible? Actually, I think it's to do with the assumptions that you put into what are called the relativity equations of Einstein. And if you change the assumptions, then the very theory of relativity actually just show you that processes go on at different rates in different parts of the universe.